I'll invite you to stand if you're able for the reading and the hearing of the gospel. It comes to us from the gospel according to Luke, the 15th chapter, beginning in the first verse. By this time, that means by the time Jesus has said all those hard sayings we've been reading for the last 15 weeks, by this time, a lot of men and women of doubtful reputation were hanging around Jesus, listening intently. The Pharisees and religion scholars were not pleased at all. They growled, "He takes in sinners and eats with them," treating them like old friends. Their grumbling triggered Jesus to tell this story. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and lost one. Wouldn't you leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the lost one until you found it? When found, you can be sure you would put it across your shoulders, rejoicing. And when you got home, call in your friends and neighbors, saying, "Celebrate with me, I've found my lost sheep." Count on it. There's more joy in heaven over one sinner's rescued life than over 99 good people in no need of rescue. Or imagine a woman who has 10 coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and scour the house, looking in every nook and cranny until she finds it? And when she finds it, you can be sure she'll call her friends and neighbors. "Celebrate with me," she'll say. "I've found my lost coin." Count on it. That's the kind of party God's angels throw every time one lost soul returns to God. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Now it is 11:35, which means I can almost guarantee that I am not the first person to ask you today, do you remember where you were on this day 15 years ago? September the 11th, 2001. Do you remember where you were? Do you remember what you were doing? And do you remember how you felt that day? I want you to think about those three questions for a moment. On September the 11th, 2001, do you remember where you were, what you were doing, and how you felt? Now, I understand that this is not a fair question because we have children and we have young people in here who were not living on September the 11th, 2001, were not yet born. But I can promise you that we have children and young people who live in a world that is still chaotic and still worrisome. I had grandparents' lunch with my 7-year-old granddaughter on Friday. And we were sitting eating our lumpy cold eggs and grits. And Kendall turned to me and said, "Gam, did you know our PE teacher has been here this is the way she said it, 31 years? And we've had not one intruder." And I said, "Oh, is your PE teacher the security at the school?" "No," she said. I said, "Well, what does that have to do, your PE teacher being here 31 years, not having an intruder?" She said, "I don't know, but we haven't had not one intruder." And I said, "Well, that's good, Kendall. What's an intruder?" And she said, "It's a bad person that comes in here to do bad things, and we haven't had one." I said, "Do you have intruder drills?" And she said, "Yeah. We all get in a corner in our classroom. But you know what? There's a mirror." 7-year-old. "You know what? There's a mirror, and that intruder could see us from that mirror, so I'm standing in the back." If you don't think your children live in a world that understands fear, if you don't think these little precious grandbabies, hey daddies, hey mommies, that are up here understand that there's something not right in the world, then get your head out of the sand because they know, they feel it. You and I lost our sense of security and our sense of comfort in this country 15 years ago today. And I remember where I was and what I was doing and what I was thinking. I was in my office at Epworth United Methodist Church, Main Square, Joanna, South Carolina. There's only one square. That morning, I was working on charge conference forms. Some things never change. And my phone rang, and I knew when my phone rang at church that it was either my husband, my daughter, my parents, or some of my protectors in town telling me that a couple of the people who were not very good to me were on the street and I needed to lock the church door. I knew it was one of those 4 calls. And it was my husband. And I answered the phone and said, Epworth United Methodist Church, this is Sandra. And he said, have you heard what happened? And I said, no. What happened? And he said, somebody flew a plane into one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and it's a mess. He said, go home and turn on the television. And so I did. And I went home and I turned on the television and I saw this sight that is forever burned in my memory. And those of you who did the same thing have this same picture burned. You have black smoke billowing out of what is left of the first tower. You have a mental picture of people jumping out of windows knowing that they will die, but dying falling from a window is less painful than being burned to death. You have pictures of utter chaos, falling debris, people running everywhere, screams, all kinds of intrusive and disruptive sounds. And if you're like me, you watch and another plane crashes into that second tower. And you're glued. You can't look away. I sat there and I watched, and we heard about a plane that hit the Pentagon, and we heard about another plane that went down in a field in Pennsylvania because of brave passengers who gave their own lives, were able to subdue the terrorists so that they did not reach their destination in Washington, D.C. They showed live pictures, and they looped that picture of the first plane and then the second plane over and over, so that if you watch that day or the next day or the next day or the next day or the next day, you saw the same pictures time and time again. But if you looked at those pictures, you also saw that when people were running away from death and chaos, there were also people running toward it. We saw firefighters and police officers and military personnel. We saw strangers putting other strangers braced on their shoulders to carry them away from the destruction that was happening in front of our very eyes. We saw a priest of St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church across the street who was kneeling in one picture, comforting a dying person who lost his own life that day, comforting others. And as we continued to watch that week, we saw lines of people waiting to donate blood in order to help those who had survived. I remember watching that on television. I don't know how long I sat there and watched, but it was a while. Of course, I called my daughter and said, "Are you okay? I don't know what's happening, but know I love you and stay safe." I called my parents and did the same. But as I sat there, I thought, I've got to do something. And so I went back to the office at Epworth United Methodist Church on the square in Joanna, and I began to write some prayers. And I wrote prayers of comfort for those of us living in absolute fear at the moment, not knowing what was to happen next. I wrote prayers for healing for those in the midst of that chaos. Prayers for safety for those who rushed in when others were rushing away. prayers for hope for everybody living with this new horror that we hadn't faced before. I printed those off and I made some copies. And I went to the sanctuary and I opened the front doors. We had double front doors like here. And then I walked to the bell tower, which I had not been in before. And I climbed up that little ladder to the bell tower. And it was a short little rope and a really big bell. And I reached up with both hands and I started to ring that bell. It was one of those Quasimodo kind where when it goes up, your feet almost leave the ground. And I rang that bell and I rang that bell until my arms got tired. That wasn't very long, by the way, I'm sure. I didn't know until later that bell had not been rung in 30 years because they were pretty sure if you tried it, it would break and fall through the roof. You need to tell your preacher if you know secrets like that, whether you like them or not. But I made my way back down that bell tower when my arms were tired, and I gathered my prayers, and I stood in that open doorway in the narthex, and I watched. There were projects to the right of the square, and I watched people come out of those projects. Drug addicts, alcoholics, single mamas not married with 5 or 6 children. Some of those people that I was warned about, lock your doors for. Folks just down on their luck. I saw people coming from behind me, from the houses where the little old people lived. Coming from my left, from the better part of the mill village there, built by Greenwood Mills, brick houses, nice. I saw people coming from across the white line. Now, you may know what that is. Many southern communities had a line called the white line or the black line, and you didn't cross it if you were a particular color. And I saw people from the other side of white line. These would have been dark-skinned people cross the line because of this bell. And people came in all afternoon. I was there, I think, about 4 hours. It might have been longer, I don't know. But people came in, most said not one word. And I didn't hold a service. What did I have to say at that moment? But as people came in, I hugged them. And I said, I've just written some prayers in case you need some help getting started. The sanctuary's open. I saw people go down, some kneel at the altar. I saw some sit in the front pews. I saw some sit in the back. Some just stood in the aisle. A few took a prayer and left. But people came because everybody felt a great sense of loss that day. And that's what I could do. I could offer a place to gather and prayers and a remembrance that God is with us, even in the midst of chaos and terror and destruction. On September 11th, 2001, there was a pilot of a charter boat sitting at home watching TV just like I did. And he saw that second plane fly into the second tower. And he looked at his wife sitting there in the living room watching TV, and he said, I've got to do something. And he got up and he kissed his wife, and he ran out the door, and he got in his boat. And he joined hundreds of other watercraft, ferries and charter boats and Coast Guard. Anybody willing to risk their lives, who had gone to try to get people from the island of Manhattan, which was cut off by emergency personnel when the first bomb, they thought at the time, went off, so that you could not cross the bridges, you could not use the commuter lanes, you couldn't get off the island by car. Because people were sitting around thinking, I've got to do something. More than 500,000 people were rescued by boat 15 years ago, September the 11th, 2001. And not one person being rescued nor one rescuer was injured. Not one. Today is a day that we remember. And while we remember the tragedy of that event, while we remember those whose lives were lost, while we remember that picture that will forever be burned in our memories, you and I must never forget that we are Christian people, and that means we have a different kind of memory than just everybody. We have a holy remembrance. Last week we came up here to the table and we took bread and we took the cup and we heard the words from Jesus, every time you do this, remember me. Those of us with a sense of holy remembering, while we remember the tragedy and the horror, we also remember the salvation that occurred that day as people gave their own lives and took risks in order to save others. We remember the hope that was offered, even by a priest that lost his own life, and by so many other strangers that may never meet again this side of heaven. Mr. Rogers, the Presbyterian minister that turned into a TV children's minister of sorts, always said, and he said it on that day, your children will be frightened, but anytime you see tragedy in the world, always look for the helpers, because there will always be helpers. And so today, with our holy remembering, we remember not just the tragedy and the lives that were lost, but we remember the hope and the help that was offered that day. Jesus said, when he was ridiculed for eating and drinking and hanging out with the wrong people, with sinners, Jesus said, there was a shepherd who lost one sheep, and leaving the 99 safely in the pen, that's not what he said, leaving the 99 in the wilderness, he went off until he found that one, and he put him on his shoulders and carried him back to safety. And called his neighbors and said, rejoice with me, for the one who was lost has been found. And there was a woman who lost a coin, and she did everything in her power, sweeping, moving furniture, getting down on her hands and knees and looking, until she found that lost coin, and she restored it to the other 9 and called her neighbors and friends and said, rejoice with me, for that which has been lost has been found. Friends of holy remembering, on this day, this anniversary of one of the most horrible events imaginable, and certainly in this country, we remember that there were many who were lost that were found that day. Many brought to safety. Many who had their lives saved and restored because of the people who said, I've got to do something. You and I live in a world where our 7-year-olds have to have intruder drills in the schools. And all they know that it's a bad person that comes in to do bad things, and that's more than they need to know. And so might I suggest to you that when we look out at a world that is chaotic and in trouble and dying, that we ought to say to ourselves, I've got to do something. Because you and I are the bearers of good news. That even when the world is falling apart all around us, that Jesus the Christ holds us together and holds us close to Him and gives us that hope and peace and comfort that I wrote about in those prayers 15 years ago in that little bitty town of Joanna, South Carolina. You remember where you were. You remember what you were doing. And I hope that you remember feeling, gosh, I wish I could do something. Because too often we say, ain't it a shame somebody ought to do something? When we can all do something. We can pray for this world of ours. We can love and be kind and, yes, eat and drink with sinners if that's what it takes. But most of all, we can share the good news that while all this is happening, there's one who holds it all together. We serve the God who created the universe. And when He saw it in such a mess, sent His Son to give His life so that we might have everlasting life. So that when this temporary life that we live in these bodies is done, that's not all there is. Do you realize you've got the good news? The next time you look around and you see somebody in trouble and you just want to do something, remember that you have the Christ living in you who did it all for all of us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.